Hi, we're Ralph and Lahni back with another astrological minute or 10.
Yes.
Take it away, Ralph.
We're going to explain about the symbols, the planetary symbols. We call them the glyphs. You can, in some ways, think of them as the original emojis. And they're based upon really fairly simple symbolism and a few components. And the components, of course, come from the planets. Now, the most ancient one, which is found in a lot of spiritual approaches and beliefs, is the circle with the dot. And of course, that's the sun. It's the circle of spirit and the dot of consciousness. So that's the sun. Makes perfect sense. But spirit shows up in many places. So, for instance, Mercury is the circle of spirit with the crescent of emotion above.
Of course, the moon is the crescent of emotion, right?
Exactly. And so the crescent of emotion is our flexibility on our emotional side, our emotional balance, our ability to give and take and to nurture and to be nurtured. And that's the crescent. In some ways you could think of it as the bowl. You know, if you watch the lunations in the course of the month, the moon goes from the little crescent and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and then shrinks again. And there's a certain point when it looks like a smile setting in the west. And that's like the crescent bowl. It's, you know, it can hold things. And the concept of the crescent moon is that it holds things. The moon holds things. That's why it's connected to water.
And the cross at the bottom of the symbol of Mercury is the cross of density, of
matter.
Matter, right?
Exactly. So those are the basic three parts of it: is the circle of spirit, the crescent of emotion, the cross of matter.
In fact, the symbol for the earth, which is one that's not commonly known, is the circle of consciousness, but it has a cross
Yes.
of density inside of. Then we come up to Venus.
Yes. So where Venus is the circle of spirit on top of the cross of matter, Mercury is based on matter too, but it's the circle of spirit with emotions above. But with Venus, it's spirit, you know, grounded to earth. And then Mars. Here, the circle of spirit is below. And the cross of matter is above, turned into an arrow.
With direction.
With
right.
direction.
So we often talk about how the Mars energy is an externalized energy, and you can see that from the symbology.
And the height matters, because like in Mercury, for instance, the flexibility to other people, that's what matters the most. You know, Mercury rules Virgo and Gemini, two of the mutable signs. And just like that, they're flexible. That flexibility is the most important thing over spirit, and the matter is the foundation. But with Venus, spirit matters most, above matter. With Mars, matter is above and spirit is below.
Actually, a little bit to the side.
A little bit to the side.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
You know, and that symbolism of the arrow is an ancient tradition, of course, as well. And then you have Jupiter. Jupiter is the crescent
Of emotion.
Sitting on the cross of matter. Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius, the other two mutable signs. But instead of sitting above spirit, it's basically Jupiter's
aligned next to.
Aligned next to it. And the circle of spirit's not there. Why? The circle of spirit's associated with the sun. Jupiter is the prince. It's not the king, it's the prince. Jupiter is, you know, the largest planet in the solar system.
Another planetary glyph, the one for Saturn, also doesn't have the circle of spirit involved in it.
Right. And that's the cross of matter above the crescent. So they're the reverse of each other. Jupiter is the crescent of matter, crescent of emotion above matter, and Saturn is matter above the crescent of emotion. And Saturn oftentimes is about putting the practical things ahead of emotions.
And in fact, if you take the glyph for Jupiter and turn it upside down, or do it the other way around with Saturn, you get a stylized glyph of the other one.
Exactly.
So they are very related to each other.
Exactly. And this is part of the dynamic. You know, Jupiter is about expansion and compassion. So of course, people's emotions come first. Saturn is about ambition and accomplishment, so of course the practical matters are paramount. And it was always interesting that, Saturn is the most outer of the visible planets, and so it was like the wall of the city. It was the thing that protected us from the outer world, but it was also, it's symbolic of time. And, the way in which the body builds is actually tied to the Saturn cycles. And that was also part of the protection of life, that there is a time limit.
So then we get to Uranus, which has a really larger cross of matter above a small circle of spirit.
Right, exactly. And it's also stylized too, because it's stylized as an H. And that's for the person who discovered it, Herschel. But once again, it's matter above and then spirit below with the cross. But the spirit's there. And that's where the dynamic is different. Jupiter and Saturn do not have the circle. Uranus does. It has to do with when Uranus was discovered. It was the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, where people started becoming aware of this. And it was during the movement for the American Revolution, for the French Revolution, for during the time of Bonaparte, when there was all this liberation going on throughout Europe, and it was also a very, very important time in terms of spiritual growth in society, and yet it was the spirit projecting up into matter. Well, that's the liberation of people.
Then we have Neptune, and a lot of people think of Neptune, the symbol, as kind of Neptune's trident, god of the sea. But it really is made up of a cross of matter piercing through the crescent of emotion. And so when we associate Neptune with things like inspiration and divine guidance and things like that, you can kind of see that it's bringing sort of reality and structure through a veil of this emotion.
And it's interesting too, because in this, stylized trident, the central, axis is as high as the top of the crescent. So it says, in my application, the practical is as important as the spiritual, as the emotional, but the emotional brackets it. And this is one of the things about Neptune in terms of how we see it affects people and affects society, has a lot to do with how we believe. What do we believe is important? What do we believe is valuable? Why do people spend a lot of money for certain things when you feel like the intrinsic value is not any dramatically different from something else? Why do we buy clothes that have a certain label when the knockoff is maybe as good? That's why we buy it, because of that belief in a certain brand or a certain image.
Then we get to Pluto.
Yes.
I still call it one of my favorite planets. It's not a little planetoid. It hasn't been demoted anywhere. But there's a couple of symbols for Pluto, just as there are for a few other things. And the one that we use on the calendar is the one that is actually the initials of the person who discovered Pluto, Percival Lowell.
Well,
easy for me to say, right?
Yeah.
So it looks like a P superscripted over an L. But the symbol that we use more in our work is the one that has the circle of spirit suspended in a crescent of emotion being held up by the cross of matter.
So there's actually a space between the crescent. This is actually the only glyph that's used for the planets that are multi-parted, where they're not connected.
Right.
And remember, this was discovered in the 30s and 40s, where people became aware of it at the time when there were dramatic work being done in science with atomic energy and such, and levitation and using magnets to lift things up, and this was a dramatic time. And so this was symbolic in part of these times in which science was becoming so powerful. But it's interesting that the circle of spirit was above.
Right. But contained. In the emotions.
And contained in that which matters to people.
Yeah.
So the symbols are fascinating, and a lot of thought has been put into them, and many of them, of course, go back thousands of years. Venus and Mars and the sun. The sun symbol is found throughout the spiritual and religious history.
And of course, we use the symbol for Venus and Mars in daily life.
Yes.
And so as you get familiar with these symbols, maybe it's helpful for you to understand a little bit about what the deeper meaning of these symbols are, not just to, a random assignment to show what planet. And we'll do another minute or 10 about some of the other symbology and the aspects or the zodiac signs and even in the asteroids.
So come back and see us again here at Planetary Calendar.
Bye-bye.